And we're back with Chapter 3, Morbid Curiosity. Details. The next day, Brooke Bluebell, a girl from Penrose, the next town, had been found. That is, most of a girl named Brooke Bluebell. Subcutaneous wounds and bite patterns consist with some wild animal attack, but the coroner could not determine what kind. Coyote? Bear? Mountain lion? Murder wasn't suspected, but rumor was not gun-shy. Rape. Devil worship. Another one just like this, etc. In first period gym class, Alex Finster, knowing Peter was in hearing range, said he had heard it was gypsies. Fucking gypsy cannibals taste like chicken. Well, people meat is more like bacon, said Peter. Ashley Valentine looked at him with disgust. I mean, that's what they say, said Peter. In the main building, Peter ran into Vice Principal Spears coming out of the faculty restroom. Vice Principal Spears never had anything to say to Peter. Vice Principal Spears was happy to pretend Peter did not exist, so long as Peter gave him no reason otherwise. Neither had anything bad to say about the arrangement, but this morning gave Peter a thoughtful look and said, It's just terrible, isn't it? Peter nodded. Just terrible. In this day and age, Peter shook his head. This day and age. It just really makes you wonder, said Vice Principal Spears. It was probably a bear, said Peter. I bet it was a bear. Down the hall, Peter could feel the man's eyes between his shoulder blades like pinpricks. He went to his locker. On the other side of the section was some kind of hushed conversation. He paused, as it is irresistible when you are privy to business not your own, and cocked an ear. For the Lamb which is in the midst of their throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living fountains of water. Oh, gay. He continued on his way, passing two girls and Mrs. McCullum, standing with heads bowed. Mrs. McCullum's eyes were open and eager for persecution over the commingling of the church and state, and they locked on Peter's and lighted, indignant. Embarrassed, Peter gave a thumbs up. Whatever peels your banana, lady. Mrs. McCullum shut her eyes, annoyed at the presumptive Satanist's blessing. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. In the 3 weeks of school before the discovery of most of Brooke Bluebell from Penrose, Peter had made no friends and lost one. Peter and Linda Ruminek moved to Hemlock Grove midsummer. Linda's cousin Vince had died of alcohol poisoning and left his trailer on the outskirts of town to another cousin, Ruby. But Ruby was newly married to the owner of a pawn shop she frequented and had no use for so plebeian a windfall. So she passed it to Linda in exchange for half a pack of cigarettes and a hand massage. The Rumineks preferred trade to charity out of principle, and Linda gave legendary hand massages. The timing was auspicious enough. Linda and Peter had been living in a small apartment in the city nearly 2 years and were feeling the itch. 2 years was unnaturally long for a Ruminek to stay in any one place. It made a mausoleum of the brain. Hemlock Grove was, at writing this, a town in transition. Its past, Castle Godfrey, long the colloquial name for the steelworks, sat on the riverbank shuttered and half raised in a field speckled with gold and white, goldenrod, and Queen Anne's lace. The Godfrey Steel Company, founded in 1873 by Jacob Godfrey, was at its peak, an integrated steel outfit encompassing 640 acres and employing upward to 10,000 men in the endeavor of building the country on 2 axes, vertically in Manhattan and Chicago, with high-grade steel from its open hearth ovens, and horizontally to the west in the rails for its Bessemer converters, a gauntlet dropped before heaven and earth, enshrouding the sun in clouds of black dust, that required the wives of steelworkers to hang whites inside and plated the teeth of livestock miles away with steel fillings. But now, an old dead thing that interrupted a flower bed, its future, healthcare, and biotechnology, the two largest employers in the Easter Valley, now the Hemlock Acres Hospital, the flagship psychiatric facility of the regional university system, and over the next ridge, the privately run Godfrey Institute of Biomedical Technologies, the latter, the bastard, successor of the steelworks, a 480-foot incongruity of steel and glass, the summit of which was the highest point in the country, and known colloquially as the White Tower because it had not in 20 years of operations gone dark once. So after a century of long legacy as a mill town, much of Hemlock Grove had transmuted into middle-class blamelessness. But while the blood of the industry may run dry, the husk, like Castle Godfrey, still breached. Rail yards and strip mines and beached coal barges all fall into some degree of disuse or decay, streaked with tiers of rust in contrast to the forests of the region, the trees and the rivers and the hills day by day overtaking the rude, rotted exoskeleton of the Godfrey Empire, all dotted with moldering, desanctified churches that had gone the way of working class. So, why not? A change of scenery. Vince Rumenek's trailer was situated in a wooded cul-de-sac at the end of Kimmel Lane, down the hill from Kildare Park and just past the tracks. The traditional dividers of workers and management, to this day, a telling indicator of socio-economic station. Still, good to get out of the city and give your thoughts some elbow room. The nearest neighbors were a retired couple, the Wendells, who lived half a mile up in a house over a pond Peter sometimes skinny dipped in late at night. The Wendells were tame enough. They bore welcoming biscuits and euphemistic praise of Vince. One heck of a whistler, and hid their discomfiture over the Rumenek's tattoos, the visible ones at least, or Linda's tolerance of her son's semantic dispute with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's definition of minor, deduced by the number of Budweisers he consumed over their short visit, and yet how little provocation it took for his laziness to vex her into hurling curses at him in the old tongue, or the lung-flattening hug she pulled them both into on their departure. The first time I experienced Linda's embrace, I have the distinct recollection of feeling like she was trying to squeeze the last drop of toothpaste from the top of my head. Days later, they were visited by the Wendells' goddaughter, Christina. Christina was 13 and small for it, a girl with chipped painted nails and skinned knees, and a black raven's nest of bramble of hair containing a face like a single pale egg. Christina was a girl both young and old for her years. She had never shed the breathless curiosity of a child assembling a taxonomy of the known universe. What is that? Where did that come from? Why is that like that, and not another way? And what is its orientation with every other thing? Why? And the only person her own age she knew who wanted nothing more when she grew up than to be a Russian novelist. Naturally, she found it imperative to experience these unfathomable firsthand, and she was not disappointed. How perplexing and thrilling these Rumeneks. Her own parents were both production support analysts for a firm in the city, and that this lifestyle of breezy and pansthetic irreverence existed and this was somehow permissible knocked her sideways. She marveled at Peter, especially a real-life gypsy close to her own age. Half-breed, he corrected her. Nikolai, his grandfather, was full-blooded Kalderdash Roma from the Carpathian region, but had married a Gadja woman after immigrating. What does any of that mean? Said Christina. It means his bloodline will forever ride the earth on 2 horses with 1 ass, said Peter. The setting, the tone for their relationship, her confusion over what he was talking about, and the evident pleasure it gave him. Half the time she didn't understand what he was saying, and the other half whether or not he was pulling her leg. For example, the bunch of dried milk thistle and century root over the door, the purpose of which he had said was warding off the evil eye. But whose? It's more like buckling your seatbelt, he said. You just never know. And his claim that her arrival on the doorstep had been presaged by the presence of soot on a candle's wick, or the elaborate pentagram that Peter had carved into a tree trunk. Not he told her a Satan thing, but each point corresponds to an element, and the topmost the soul, and because it looks fucking metal. Enough, she demanded of Peter. How much of this business was real? He shrugged. Let's say it's a bunch of baloney, he said. Then it's baloney that's been getting people through the night since we humped in caves. Now look around. Would you say the world has its shit together any better without it? She hadn't thought of it like that. And of course it's all real, numbnuts, he said. You know it right here. He poked below her belly button. Thus her doom was sealed. For their part, the Romaneks received Christina's regular presence the same way they did a bone-bag black cat all eye and ear who started hanging around, with shrugging acceptance and one simple stipulation: eat, eat, eat. Linda was a woman as cheerful and as similarly proportionate as a beach ball whose maternal inclinations tended to encompass whatever happened to fall in her immediate field of vision. One afternoon, Peter was lying in a hammock, idly twirling a string of fetchit, so named because Nikolai's habit, owing to an immigrant's lack of sensitivity to cultural nuances, of using Stefan Fetchit as an umbrella designation for all black cats, and half listening to Christina explain to him no matter how funny it sounded, there was nothing funny about actually suffering from restless leg syndrome. And when she abruptly changed the subject and asked him if he was a werewolf, Peter's hand stopped, and the cat went for the kill. Peter cursed and sucked from his knuckle. What the hell would make you say that, he said. Your index and middle finger are the same length, she said. Peter removed the hand from his mouth and regarded his symmetrical forefingers. Jesus, he said. Where did you pick that up? I don't know. TV or something? Just one of those things floating around, I guess. But I was just looking at your hand and poof, there it is. So are you a werewolf or what? Peter shrugged. Yeah. Really? She said. You bet your ass, he said. Don't tell your grandparents. It probably would make them uncomfortable. Were you bitten by a werewolf? Peter made a face at this distasteful notion. He was no fan of violence in general, and in particular when it was directed at him. Nikolai was the seventh son of a seventh son, he said. It's in my blood. Is your mom? Nah, it's a recessive gene or some shit. The implication of the revelation crowded her head, and she tried to think of something intelligent to ask. Do you like being a werewolf? She said. What do you think? He said. I don't know. Use your imagination, dipshit. She evaluated the pros and cons. It seems like it would be kind of neat, she said. Well, it's probably about the best thing in the world for your information, he said. So there. Really? She said. Obviously, he said. She was quiet, but her mind was still a whirlwind. How about them apples? But in the tizzy of 1,001 urgent questions she had now, the foremost popped out of her mouth. Can I be a werewolf? She said. In theory, said Peter, evasive. He dangled his arms, snapping his fingers a few times, and Fetchit came and nuzzled back the back of his hand. Little prick, said Peter. Will you bite me? Said Christina. Don't be retarded, said Peter. Come on. She lifted her leg so her calf was level with him. Look how young and tender. Get that skinny, sorry drumstick out of my face, said Peter. Wouldn't do you much good anyway. You'd more likely get tetanus and die than turn. Oh, yeah? I think you're being just selfish. He considered. Well, there might be another way. She was eager. What? Go get me a beer and stop hassling me. After school started, Christina stopped spending days at the lane, and Peter saw her only in the halls, but that was the extent of their relationship. As of the first day, when she skipped over to him, hug in view of her friends, identical twins Alexa and Alyssa Sworn, as beautiful and cruel as albino tigers, who were appalled she would do anything with the walking herpes factory, let alone touch him without scoring afterwards. Though Peter did not take her distance after that personally, it was no picnic being a girl that age. But the day after most of a girl from Penrose was found in Kildare Park, Peter really wished he hadn't told Christina he was a werewolf. Peter made people nervous, and they did not have to know that once a month he discarded his man coat and roved in purview of arcane and unruly gods to feel it. He was not their kind. Peter didn't mind. He had his family and infinite roads to explore and could not imagine needing more. And if this was at the expense of fitting in, whatever that meant, so what? There was so much to learn from every place, or at least something worth watching. Who was in love with their best friend's boy or girlfriend? Who was in love with their best friend? Who cut? Who starved? Who locked themselves in the handicapped bathroom to jerk off or cry? Who was addicted to what? Or had been raped by whom? It was everywhere, a wonderful world of darkness and desire right under the roaring bleachers, if you had your eye out. But in the halls of HGHS, the greatest construction by far of curiosity and intrigue collected around two students, brother and sister Roman and Shelley Godfrey. Roman was also a senior, while within innermost ring of privilege and popularity, the Godfrey name as sovereign as DuPont or Ramesses, and he made no attempt to obscure it from hair. He would think of nothing taking a half day off of school to go into the city, half styled and bleached, his bone pallor suggesting a natural dark, not to mention general indisposition to playing outside, or the small but impressive pharmacy he carried in a tin mint container, and obviously the car. The desire to be burdened by possessions was one that had, in the main, escaped Peter, but as a teenager of traveling blood, he had no defense against anything with a combustion engine, and the fact that the car was totally metal. But Roman otherwise had little in common with the other rich kids, exhibiting a nearly complete lack of regard for social expectation, his behavior not rebellious so much as entirely unmotivated to behave in any way that didn't conform exactly to the cast of his mood at the moment, his sense of entitlement as fentanyl as the green eyes. This characteristic of his dynasty dating back to its first possessor, his 3 times great-grandfather, the legendary steel baron Jacob Godfrey, green, of course, being the color of money, it had made him mercurial. But none of this was what Peter found so compelling about Roman Godfrey. "There's an oupir at my school," Peter told Linda the first week. His Swadhythana made him sensitive to these things. "Well, goodness," she said. "What's he like?" "I don't know. He seems okay." But Peter did not attempt to strike any sort of acquaintanceship with Roman. The oupir were a queer breed. Nikolai had told him stories by large and unverifiable shadows passing through the mist, even for an old gypsy with a credulous child. But Peter had only ever encountered them personally once before, when he and Linda were living upstate. He wandered onto a lakefront property deep at Lake Erie in the woods that snow moon. The snow was thick, and the trees looked like tufts of frayed black thread pulled through a white comforter, And there were 3 of them, 1 man, 2 women, and they were drinking wine on a patio, speaking French, each nude except for one of the women, a statuesque mulatto, who wore a Santa hat. Peter knew immediately that there was something strange about these people beyond the obvious loup-garou, exclaimed the mulatto as Peter emerged from the tree line, and they called to him with great excitement. He came up the stairs, and they fawned over him in delight, patting and stroking and putting a hat on him. Making him the life of the party, he was glad to have found 3 such merry friends, but then there was a low whimpering sound in the darkness just beyond the patio, and the white woman made a sympathetic uh-oh sound as though hearing a baby in need, and taking a piece of cheese from the platter on the table and held it out to the shape hanging from a tree branch that came close to the house. Peter moved in for a closer look. His stomach became a knot. The shape was a fox with its hind legs in a snare. The leg was broken. From its pathetic emaciated appearance, it had been there a while. The woman scratched the fox's ear and held the cheese an inch or so below its lowermost reach. The fox's snout worked vainly, and she raised her hand just enough for its tongue to lap the morsel. Then, with a clumsy me expression, she dropped the cheese to the ground. The man smiled at Peter. Wasn't this a fun game? And handed him a piece of cheese. Peter was paralyzed. Many times later, he would replay the scenario where he had the presence of mind and the courage to reach out to the fox and snap its neck, but in the vital moment he possessed neither. It was a living thing with a shine still in its eyes, and he would have given anything for the bravery to take that from it. With shaking hands, he placed the cheese carefully back on the platter and walked down the steps back to the tree line, not meeting their faces. Très vulgaire, he had heard the white woman say behind him, and he felt a light thud against his back. Peter whirled to make sure he wasn't in some danger from the projectiles, but she was simply throwing cheese. The man called out insult and turned, waving his buttocks and slapping them emphatically as the mulatto observed him with cool detachment. Peter raced now into the forest, the hat falling softly in the snow behind him. For days he could hardly stop crying, but after Linda finally got him to relate the incident, she simply shook her head and said, "The French." Peter could not say whether or not what degree his classmate was of a similar character. Nevertheless, it did not seem like a bad idea to proceed with caution around Roman Godfrey. But this policy did not prevent Peter from paying careful attention to the Upier's conduct the day the news about the Penrose girl was out. Between second and third period, Roman bought an ambitious amount of coke from the resident dealer, from whom he engaged in a prolonged and emphatic debate over who would win in a fight between Batman and Wolverine, then skipped fourth period to nap in his car, a 1971 Jaguar, with what appearance of a mule cart hitched to the back. At lunch, he tossed a tater tot into Ashley Valentine's cleavage, and recess he spent sitting on the picnic table in conversation with Letha Godfrey, also a senior and Roman's first cousin, though sharing none of his more outstanding qualities except, it goes without saying, the green Godfrey eyes. In English, Mrs. Pissarro, who took particular exception to Roman's cavalier approach to scholasticism, singled him out to read an excerpt from the poem Goblin Market. She clipped a precious golden lock. She dropped a tear more rare than pearl. To Pissarro's surprise, as well as the bulk of the class, his reading was hushed and reverential, investing the dead words with all things dignity. Then sucked their first globes, fair or red, sweeter than honey from the rock, stronger than man rejoicing in wine. Clearer than water flowed that juice. She never tasted such before. How should it cloy with length of use? The room was quiet. Ashley Valentine closed her eyes. Pissarro was annoyed. Though he was technically doing what he'd been called upon, it seemed all the more diabolical species of sass. She sucked and sucked and sucked the more, fruits which that unknown orchard bore. She sucked until her lips were sore. Alex Finster said, "Poor baby." Duncan Fritz said he could make it all better. Roman looked at them wearily. "Are you fucking Philistines pretty proud of yourselves?" "Mr. Godfrey!" "Sorry, Mrs. P," he said with expert disingenuousness. "I guess we're all a little rattled with this Kildare Park thing." Peter's eyes perked. After school, Roman gave his sister a ride home. If Roman Godfrey was a riddle, Shelley was the epic fornication of mystery and enigma. In all of Peter's own unlikely travels, he had never encountered such an unlikelier specimen. Shelley was not Upir, and Peter was frankly at a loss in what the hell you would go about calling her. She was a blind spot for his Swadhisthana. Though a freshman, at least anatomically female, Shelley was 7.5 feet tall, her head and shoulders huge and hunched. Her skin was pensive gray of late November sky. One side of her already misshapen face was paralyzed. She could produce no syllables approaching coherence. But the second strangest thing about her was her boots. For lack of a better term, she wore her feet two hermetically sealed plastic cubes roughly the size of milk crates. The strangest was the glowing. Shelley climbed into the cart and Roman behind the wheel, and they drove off. Roman turning his head and looking directly at Peter, meeting his eyes, the other boy's face frank and impassive, dispelling any doubt he knew he was being watched. Roman tapped the side of his nose. "Keep it clean." The car turned from the drive, and from her cart, Shelley raised one broad palm. Peter returned the wave. He had established a precedent of being friendly to the creature, passing winks or cartly bows, one time stopping her, with his foot removing a trail of toilet paper affixed to one of her cubes. The Godfreys passed from view. Peter turned his head for his bus and discovered that he was not the only one playing I Spy today. Over by the flagpole, Christina was watching him. She startled on detection and disappeared into the flux of bodies. Peter boarded his bus and sat, one hand holding in front of him, regarding his symmetrical index and middle fingers together as though examining a manicure. His balls were in a state. That night, Peter went to the park. There was no evidence of the girl except for a warning from the police stating that anyone caught trespassing after hours would be incarcerated. He entered, drawing his fingertips in a stutter across the links of the fence, and nosed around until he found it. To say there was no evidence is an exaggeration. The land has a memory of such things. It was behind a bush, maybe 10 paces from the perimeter of the woods. Fewer you were running the spot. He laid down where Brooke Bluebell had been killed and laced his fingers behind his head and looked up at the stars and the trees and the hilltops. A few miles to the east, the halo of the White Tower, the light that never went out. Her picture was distinct in his mind. It was not that he felt any special kinship with her apart from morbid curiosity, but all the news agencies had gotten a hold of it and not collectively willed the picture. You know it, the one where she's in her cheerleading uniform and smiling not for the camera, but for her sister or best friend or a boy or any countless things to put one on her face when she had had one. The picture, pornographic with tragedy. He wondered if Roman Godfrey had done it. Peter had been up in the hills that night and smelled something, a vague but foreboding malevolence. but it was nothing that coalesced at the time. And with a mental hospital down the road, you could expect some funny vibrations come full moon. And it wasn't the first time he had felt some occult disturbance in this town. There was something else, a presence of some kind dwelling underfoot, no manner of thing under the sun. Peter could not get a grasp of its horns, but he knew it was down there, older than the hills it lived under. There had been a couple of times when in a liminal state on the hammock, a vision would come to him of a snake, a Bible-black serpent slowly and sensually consuming itself by the tail. When then his eyes would snap open, he would look at the sky through a lattice of bows and irritatedly pushed it out of his mind. Peter had a great talent for not losing sleep over questions to which he did not know the answer, for this intrusion on that very sleep really rattled his cage. But whatever it was in some dark place underneath, older than these hills, was not the same thing that had killed Brooke Bluebell from Penrose. He knew it in his Swadhisthana. The world is a body, and different parts channel its frequency differently. Some more than others, closer to the pulse of mystery underneath the illusion of the illusion. Hemlock Grove was such a place, and the thing under the hills, if the thing was not itself an overstatement, was part of it. Fearful and unknowable, like the thing that superintended the animals breathe and what trees breathe out. Could the girl have been victim of a wild young Umpire? Possibly. It was not their traditional style, but the breed was capable of far greater transgressions. Or so old wives had it. And Pebble of far... Oh, my bad. Old wives had it, and though Roman did not really seem the type, Peter was one to talk about how far to trust appearances. There was a breeze, and it carried the smell of grass. He held up his hands to feel it. It passed between his fingers when he saw something in the tree line. A gleaming. No, a twin gleaming. Eye shine. It was a pair of eyes glowing like a cat's. Peter rose. Roman Godfrey emerged. They stood apart looking at each other. Their clothes rustled in the breeze, and the cicadas were indifferent. "What was it like?" said Roman. "What was what like?" said Peter. Roman hesitated, hands together, fidgeting. "Scared?" "Killing that girl,"